Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the quieter corridors of the past in gentle, detailed examination. I'm your host, and tonight we embark on a long, unhurried journey through one of history's most profound patterns, the fall of great civilizations. Over the next few hours, we'll walk slowly through the ruins of empires, examining the subtle forces that transformed mighty kingdoms into memory. We'll explore the complex web of climate, resources, politics, and human decisions that brought low the greatest powers humanity has ever known. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin this calm exploration of history's most dramatic transformations. Part 1. Understanding Collapse. Before we examine specific civilizations, let's take our time understanding what we mean by collapse. The word itself conjures dramatic images, cities burning, armies fleeing, monuments toppling. But the reality of civilizational decline is often far more gradual, more subtle, more complex than these sudden catastrophes. When historians speak of collapse, they generally mean a rapid loss of social, political, and economic complexity. A collapse isn't simply the defeat of one dynasty by another, or the conquest of one empire by its neighbour. It's a deeper transformation, where the intricate systems that supported a complex society begin to fail, often cascading into wider failures. Think of a civilization as an elaborate machine with countless interconnected parts. Trade networks, agricultural systems, administrative bureaucracies, religious institutions, military organizations, educational systems, technological knowledge bases. All of these elements depend on each other in subtle ways. When collapse comes, it's often because these connections begin to fray. The Roman poet who copied manuscripts in the library didn't just produce literature. He participated in a vast system of knowledge preservation that required mining operations for metal tools, trade networks for papyrus or parchment, agricultural surplus to support non-farming specialists, political stability to maintain libraries, and educational institutions to train new copyists. When that system fractured, knowledge itself could disappear. Understanding collapse requires patience. We must resist the temptation to find single causes, simple explanations. The fall of civilizations is almost never about one thing. It's about the slow accumulation of stresses, the gradual erosion of resilience, the way small problems compound into larger crises. As we move through tonight's examples, you'll notice certain patterns recurring: environmental stress, economic strain, political fragmentation, social unrest, external pressures. But you'll also notice that these factors combine differently in each case, that timing matters, that contingency plays its role alongside structure. Let's begin with one of history's earliest and most mysterious collapses, the Bronze Age collapse, when the ancient world ended. Around 1200 BCE, something extraordinary happened across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Within the span of perhaps 50 years, the entire interconnected system of Bronze Age civilizations collapsed. The Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean Greece fell into a dark age. Egyptian power waned dramatically. Cities across the Levant burned and were abandoned. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries simply ceased to exist. This period, known as the Bronze Age collapse, represents one of history's most dramatic examples of systemic failure. To understand what happened, we need to first understand the world that existed before 1200 BCE. The Late Bronze Age was, in many ways, a golden age. The Eastern Mediterranean and Near East formed an interconnected world of kingdoms and empires engaged in elaborate trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. We know this from thousands of documents that survived, particularly the diplomatic archives found at Egyptian Amarna and Hittite Hattusa. Kings wrote to each other as brothers. Egyptian pharaohs married Babylonian princesses. Copper from Cyprus flowed to workshops in Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. Tin, essential for bronze production, travelled from distant sources, possibly as far as Afghanistan. Luxury goods moved along trade routes. Ivory from Africa, lapis lazuli from Central Asia, amber from the Baltic. This system was complex and sophisticated, but also fragile. It depended on political stability, functional trade routes, specialized production, and surplus resources. When multiple stresses began to compound, the entire structure proved surprisingly vulnerable. The collapse didn't happen overnight, and it didn't have a single cause. Instead, multiple factors converged in a cascade of failures. Climate played a significant role. Paleoclimate data suggests that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced severe drought conditions in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Tree ring data from Anatolia shows depressed growth during this period. Pollen records indicate agricultural decline. Contemporary texts from the region increasingly mention grain shortages and famine. For civilizations dependent on agriculture, drought meant crisis. The Hittite archives contain increasingly desperate letters about grain supplies. One Hittite king wrote that his entire land was dying of hunger. Egyptian records speak of importing grain to feed hungry populations. The careful balance of agricultural surplus that supported cities, armies, and specialized craftspeople began to fail. But climate stress alone doesn't explain the collapse. After all, previous droughts had occurred without such catastrophic results. The difference was that drought struck a system already under multiple other stresses. The late Bronze Age kingdoms maintained large professional armies and elaborate courts. These required enormous resources to sustain. Administrative texts reveal the complexity of palace economies, with detailed records of rations, land assignments, and labor obligations. The system was efficient but inflexible, with little slack for crisis. Archaeological evidence shows that in the decades before 1200 BCE, many cities were reinforcing their fortifications. This suggests growing insecurity, perhaps from raiding or warfare. Military expenses were increasing, just as agricultural productivity was declining due to drought. Then came the invasions. Egyptian texts speak dramatically of the Sea Peoples, a confederation of groups that attacked the Eastern Mediterranean. The most famous account comes from the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, describing great movements of peoples who came from the sea and from the north. Who exactly the Sea Peoples were remains debated. The Egyptian texts give names Peleset, Jekka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. Some scholars connect these to later known groups like the Philistines. But whether these were invading armies, migrating refugees, or opportunistic raiders taking advantage of weakening kingdoms remains unclear. What's clear is that around 1200 BCE, many major Bronze Age centres were violently destroyed. The Hittite capital Hattusa burned. Major Mycenaean palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were destroyed. Cities across Cyprus and the Levant show destruction layers. The archaeological record speaks of widespread violence. But here's where the story becomes more complex and more interesting. Not everywhere was destroyed. Some cities survived or even thrived. Some destructions occurred decades apart. Some sites show abandonment without destruction. The pattern isn't simple conquest, but rather systemic failure. The key insight is that the Bronze Age Mediterranean world was an interconnected system. When parts of it failed, the ripple effects spread. A city that survived destruction might still collapse if its trade partners vanished, if its grain suppliers failed, if the tin needed for bronze production stopped arriving. Consider the bronze itself, the material that gave this age its name. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was relatively available from Cyprus and other sources, but tin was rare and came from distant sources. The supply chains for tin were elaborate, passing through multiple intermediaries. When those chains broke, bronze production became difficult or impossible. Without bronze, you couldn't make tools or weapons effectively. Without effective tools and weapons, you couldn't maintain agriculture or defense. Without agriculture and defense, cities couldn't function. This is systemic collapse, cascading failures where problems compound and multiply. The result was a transformation of the Mediterranean world. The elaborate palace economies of the Bronze Age vanished. Writing disappeared in some regions, including Greece, which wouldn't recover literacy for 400 years. Population declined dramatically. People abandoned cities and returned to simpler village life. Long-distance trade diminished to a trickle. But this wasn't the end of civilization in the region. It was a transformation, a simplification, a dark age that eventually gave way to new forms of society. The Iron Age that emerged used a more readily available metal, relied less on centralized palace economies, and eventually developed new political forms, including the Greek city-states and later classical civilizations. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us several lessons about how civilizations fail. First, complexity creates vulnerability. The more interconnected and specialized a system becomes, the more fragile it can be to disruption. Second, multiple stresses compound in unpredictable ways. Drought plus political instability plus military pressure created a cascade that no single factor could have triggered alone. Third, collapse is often systemic. When key nodes in a network fail, the entire network can unravel surprisingly quickly. Let us sit with these lessons as we move forward in time to a civilization that would come to dominate much of the ancient world. Rome, the slow decline of empire. The fall of Rome has captivated historians for over 1500 years. Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published beginning in 1776, runs to 6 volumes and traces what Gibbon saw as a long decline from the heights of the Antonine dynasty in the 2nd century CE to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The question of why Rome fell has generated literally hundreds of theories. Some blame Christianity for sapping Roman martial virtue. Others point to lead poisoning from plumbing. Still others emphasize barbarian invasions, economic decay, military failures, or moral decline. The reality, as we'll explore slowly over the next while, is that Rome's fall was an immensely complex process that unfolded differently in different regions over several centuries. There was no single moment when Rome fell, no simple explanation for its transformation. Let's begin at a high point. In the 2nd century CE, during the reigns of the so-called Five Good Emperors, the Roman Empire reached perhaps its greatest extent and prosperity. The empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers to the Sahara Desert. An estimated 50 to 70 million people lived under Roman rule. This was an impressive achievement of political organization. A single government, legal system, and military structure governed this vast territory. Latin and Greek served as common languages. Roman citizenship extended increasingly widely. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean and beyond, with Roman merchants reaching India and China. The economy was sophisticated. Agriculture formed the base, with large estates called latifundia producing grain, wine, and olive oil. Manufacturing centres specialised in pottery, metalwork, textiles, and other goods. Money economy functioned across the empire. Cities grew large, with Rome itself housing perhaps 1 million people. But this apparent stability masked underlying vulnerabilities. The Roman system required enormous resources to maintain. The military alone consumed perhaps half of state revenues. The standing army numbered around 300,000 to 400,000 soldiers stationed along thousands of miles of frontier. This military had to be paid, fed, equipped, and kept loyal, maintaining internal order, administering justice, building infrastructure, staging public entertainment, feeding urban populations. All of this required money. The Roman state raised revenue primarily through taxes on agriculture, trade, and provinces. But the administrative capacity to collect these taxes was limited. Much depended on local elites cooperating with Roman authority. The 3rd century CE brought crisis. Between 235 and 284, at least 26 individuals claimed the imperial title, most ruling briefly before being overthrown or killed. This period, known as the Crisis of the 3rd century, saw the empire fragment into competing states. Civil wars rage almost continuously, and external enemies attack repeatedly. The causes of this crisis were multiple and interconnected. Economically, the silver content of Roman coinage had been gradually declining since the reign of Nero. By the mid-3rd century, the denarius contained only about 5% silver. This inflation eroded the currency's value and made it difficult for the state to pay soldiers or purchase goods. Militarily, pressure on the frontiers was increasing. In the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire proved a formidable opponent, more organized and aggressive than previous Persian states. In the north, Germanic peoples were consolidating into larger confederations capable of coordinated attacks. The Roman military system, designed for gradual expansion and frontier defense, struggled with multiple simultaneous crises. Politically, the succession system was inherently unstable. Unlike hereditary monarchies, Roman emperors could come from any background if they commanded sufficient military support. This meant that ambitious generals with loyal armies could make bids for power. The empire, often fragmented as different regions, supported different claimants. The crisis of the 3rd century nearly destroyed the empire. For a time, the western provinces formed a separate Gallic empire, while the eastern regions organized under Palmyrene control. Germanic tribes raided deep into the empire. Plague struck repeatedly, possibly killing substantial portions of the population. Recovery came under strong military emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian, but the empire that emerged from the crisis was different from the earlier Roman state. Diocletian's reforms in the late 3rd century restructured everything. The empire was divided administratively into eastern and western halves, each with its own Augustus and junior Caesar. The military was reorganized and enlarged. The bureaucracy expanded enormously. Tax collection became more systematic and burdensome. The economy became increasingly controlled and regulated. These reforms stabilized the empire, but came at a cost. The larger bureaucracy and military required more revenue. Tax burdens increased on agricultural populations already struggling with inflation and economic disruption. The expanded state intervened more directly in economic life, regulating prices, requiring occupations to pass from father to son, and tying peasants to the land. Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century added another transformation. Christianity had grown from a persecuted minority to a major force. Constantine's favor gave the church enormous resources and authority. The alliance between Christian church and Roman state would shape European history for over 1,000 years. But Christianity didn't save Rome. By the late 4th century, new pressures were building on the frontiers. The catalyst came from the steppes of Central Asia. Around 375, the Huns, a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppes, began pushing westward. Their arrival set off a chain reaction among Germanic peoples along the Roman frontier. The Goths, facing Hunnic pressure, asked permission to settle within the empire. The Romans agreed, but then mistreated the Gothic refugees. The result was the Battle of Adrianople in 378, where Gothic warriors killed the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens and destroyed much of his army. This battle marked a shift. Increasingly, Germanic peoples would settle within Roman territory, maintain their own identities and military organizations, and eventually establish kingdoms that gradually replaced Roman authority. The Western Empire fragmented through the 5th century. Vandals crossed into Spain and then North Africa, eventually capturing Carthage in 439. Visigoths settled in southern Gaul and Spain. Franks expanded in northern Gaul. Britain, attacked by Saxons and Picts, was abandoned by Roman administration in the early 5th century. Rome itself was sacked by Visigoths under Alaric in 410 and by Vandals in 455. These events shocked the Roman world. Rome hadn't been captured by foreign enemies in 800 years. When Augustine wrote The City of God, he was partly responding to pagan Romans who blamed Christianity for Rome's vulnerability. The traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. But this date is somewhat arbitrary. The Western Empire had effectively ceased to function as a unified state decades earlier. Germanic kingdoms were already established across former Roman territories. Yet, this wasn't the sudden catastrophe sometimes imagined. For many people in the former Western Empire, daily life continued much as before, at least initially. The Germanic kings often maintained Roman administrative systems, used Latin for official documents, claimed to rule on behalf of the Eastern Emperor, and preserved much of Roman law and culture. What changed was the capacity to maintain the complex infrastructure of Roman civilization. Roads weren't maintained as carefully, long-distance trade diminished, cities shrank as the economic basis for urban life eroded, literacy declined as the educational system fragmented, the sophisticated economy simplified into more local agricultural arrangements. The Eastern Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, survived with its capital at Constantinople. It would endure for another 1,000 years, maintaining Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian faith. At various points, Byzantine emperors reconquered parts of the West, including Italy under Justinian in the 6th century. But the world of unified Mediterranean civilization under Roman rule had ended. The Middle Ages had begun, with Western Europe fragmenting into smaller kingdoms, while the Byzantine East maintained modified Roman traditions. What caused Rome's fall? The question has no simple answer. Economically, the empire struggled with declining productivity, inflation, and the enormous costs of maintaining military and bureaucracy. The tax burden fell heavily on a shrinking productive population, especially as plague may have reduced populations in some periods. Militarily, Rome faced increasing pressure from more organized enemies, while its own military became progressively barbarized with Germanic soldiers and commanders. The Western Empire's military capacity declined while threats intensified. Politically, the Western Empire fragmented as central authority weakened. Regional commanders and Germanic kings held real power, while nominal emperors were often puppets or children. The administrative capacity to govern such vast territories was eroding. Socially, the empire was dividing into a small elite owning vast estates and a large class of dependent peasants. The middle class that had formed Roman civic life declined. Social mobility decreased. The vitality of urban culture faded as cities depended on grain doles and entertainment rather than productive economies. Culturally, some argue that Roman martial values declined, though this is debated. Christianity may have shifted emphasis from earthly glory to spiritual salvation, though Christian Romans certainly fought as fiercely as pagans. The cultural confidence of earlier Rome had perhaps faded. Environmentally, some evidence suggests climate change and disease played roles. The Roman climate optimum of warm, stable weather may have ended. Plague struck repeatedly. Lead poisoning from plumbing may have affected health, though this theory is controversial. None of these factors alone explains Rome's fall. What's crucial is how they interacted and compounded. Economic strain made it harder to pay for defense. Military pressure required higher taxes, straining the economy further. Political fragmentation weakened both economic and military capacity. Social divisions reduced civic cohesion. Cultural changes affected political loyalty. Rome fell not through a single catastrophe, but through gradual erosion of the complex systems that sustained imperial civilization. When we say Rome fell, we really mean that Roman civilization transformed into something simpler, more fragmented, more local. The fall wasn't an ending, but a transition. Let us rest here for a moment, contemplating the slow transformation of the greatest empire the ancient Mediterranean world had known, before we journey eastward to examine other great collapses. The Maya collapse in the jungle, deep in the rainforests of Central America. The Maya civilization built one of the ancient world's most sophisticated cultures. Between roughly 2000 BCE and 900 CE, the Maya developed complex writing, advanced mathematics, including the concept of zero, precise astronomical observations, elaborate architecture, and organized political states. The Maya are particularly interesting for our discussion because their collapse has been intensively studied using modern archaeological techniques, allowing us to trace the process with considerable detail. And what that evidence reveals is a collapse driven largely by environmental factors interacting with social and political structures. First, let's understand what we mean by the Maya. This wasn't a single empire, but rather a collection of city-states sharing language, culture, and religion, but often warring with each other. Major centers included Tikal, Copan, Palenque, Calakmul, and dozens of others. The classic Maya period, from roughly 250 to 900 CE, saw these city-states reach their peak. Massive pyramids towered over jungle canopies, ball courts hosted ritual games, plazas filled with carved monuments recording the deeds of kings. Populations grew dense, with estimates of several million people in the Maya lowlands at the peak. Maya society was hierarchical. Divine kings ruled, claiming descent from gods and communicating with the supernatural realm through ritual bloodletting and vision quests. Below them ranged nobles, priests, warriors, merchants, craftspeople, and farmers. Intensive agriculture fed this population, with terracing, raised fields, and forest gardens supplementing traditional slash and burn cultivation. The Maya achievement was remarkable. Their writing system could express the full range of language. Their astronomical knowledge allowed precise prediction of solar and lunar eclipses. Their long count calendar tracked time over millions of years. Their architecture incorporated sophisticated understanding of acoustics and orientation to celestial events. But this civilization rested on an inherently challenging foundation: tropical agriculture in a region with unreliable water supplies. The Yucatan Peninsula lacks surface rivers. Maya cities depended on rainfall collected in reservoirs, cenotes, natural sinkholes reaching groundwater, and seasonal swamps called bejos. This worked during periods of adequate rainfall, but the region experiences cyclical droughts, and the Maya climate was less stable than once thought. When drought struck, the results could be catastrophic. The collapse of classic Maya civilization occurred during the terminal classic period, roughly 800 to 900 CE. The process unfolded differently in different regions, but followed a general pattern. Construction ceased, monuments stopped being erected, populations declined dramatically, and eventually cities were abandoned to the forest. The southern lowlands, including Tikal and other major centers, collapsed earliest and most completely. The northern lowlands, including sites like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, continued longer before also declining. But overall, the 9th century saw dramatic transformation across the Maya region. For generations, archaeologists debated what happened. Theories included invasion, disease, peasant revolt, trade route disruption, and environmental degradation. Modern evidence points toward a combination of drought and civilizational vulnerabilities. Paleoclimate research reveals that the terminal classic period coincided with severe droughts. Multiple lines of evidence converge on this finding. Lake sediment cores show low water levels. Speleothem records from cave formations indicate reduced rainfall. The timing of these droughts correlates remarkably well with the sequence of Maya collapse across different regions. The most severe droughts occurred approximately in the periods 810 to 860 and then 900 to 950. Not coincidentally, these periods saw the most dramatic abandonments of Maya cities. But drought alone doesn't explain the collapse. After all, earlier droughts had occurred without such catastrophic results. The 9th century droughts struck a civilization that had made itself vulnerable through its own success. Population had grown dense. Tikal, at its peak, may have housed 100,000 people or more, an enormous concentration for a tropical forest environment. The surrounding landscape was intensively farmed, with forests cleared for fields. The environmental buffering capacity of the forest was reduced. Soil erosion increased. Maya agriculture depended on relatively thin tropical soils. Intensive farming without adequate fallowing depleted soil fertility. Erosion washed soil into reservoirs, reducing their capacity. The landscape became less productive and less able to cope with drought. Political competition intensified as resources strained. Maya city-states were constantly jockeying for prestige and power. Kings legitimized their rule through success in war and the ability to conduct elaborate rituals. This required resources, food surpluses to feed warriors and support ceremonial centers, captives for sacrifice, and wealth to display royal power. As resources became scarcer, competition intensified. The archaeological record shows increasing warfare in the Terminal Classic. Fortifications appeared around cities that previously had none. Elite monuments increasingly celebrated military victories. The violence of the period is palpable in the archaeological remains. This warfare was counterproductive. It disrupted agriculture, diverted labor from farming to fighting, destroyed infrastructure, and depleted resources. In a time of environmental stress, Maya city-states were fighting each other rather than cooperating to manage scarcity. The political structure itself created vulnerability. Maya kings legitimized their rule through divine connections and the ability to bring prosperity. When drought caused crop failures and famine, this challenged royal authority. Kings couldn't make it rain, couldn't prevent hunger. The political system's legitimacy eroded. We can see this in the archaeological record through the cessation of monument building. Maya kings erected carved monuments called stelae to commemorate important dates and events. During the collapse, these monuments simply stop appearing. The last dated monuments at different cities mark the sequence of collapse. Tikal's last monument dates to 869, Copan's to 822, Palenque's to 799. The cessation of monument building suggests political breakdown. Either kings lacked the resources and labor to erect monuments, or the political system itself was failing, making royal display pointless. Either way, it indicates systemic crisis. Population decline followed. The archaeological evidence for population is indirect but compelling. Settlement surveys show dramatic decreases in occupation. Studies of construction activity show sharp drops. Analysis of agricultural systems shows abandonment of intensive farming. Where did people go? Some probably died from famine, disease, and violence. Some migrated to other regions, perhaps to the northern Maya lowlands, which continued longer, or to other areas entirely. Some returned to simpler village life in less dense settlements, where subsistence agriculture could support smaller populations. The great cities gradually emptied. Without populations to maintain them, the stone buildings were reclaimed by jungle. Vines cracked walls, trees grew through plazas, rain dissolved plaster. Within generations, the great temples were green mounds in the forest. But this wasn't the extinction of Maya people or culture. Maya civilization continued in modified form in the northern Yucatan. Maya people, speaking Maya languages and maintaining Maya cultural traditions, survived throughout the region. Spanish conquistadors in the 1600s encountered active Maya kingdoms. What collapsed was the classic Maya political and social structure, the divine kingship system, the elaborate ceremonial centers, the dense urban populations, the complex social hierarchies. Maya civilization simplified, decentralized, and adapted. The Maya collapse teaches us about the relationship between civilization and environment. The Maya built a sophisticated culture in a challenging environment. Their agricultural systems were impressive but fragile. Population growth and political competition created vulnerability. When environmental stress came in the form of drought, the system couldn't cope. This wasn't a failure of Maya intelligence or capability. The Maya were as intelligent and capable as any people. Rather, it demonstrates how civilizations can create conditions for their own collapse through success that pushes environmental limits combined with political structures that prevent effective response to crisis. The Maya collapse also shows the importance of political fragmentation in determining civilization's fate. The competing Maya city-states couldn't coordinate response to regional environmental crisis. Each pursued its own interests, often through warfare with neighbors. A unified political system might have better managed resources and population during drought. Finally, the Maya case illustrates that collapse isn't ending. Maya people survived and adapted. Their descendants still live throughout Central America, speaking Maya languages and maintaining cultural traditions. The civilization transformed rather than disappeared. Let us pause here and consider these rainforest cities slowly consumed by jungle, monuments to both human achievement and human vulnerability to environmental change. The Khmer Empire, temples in the jungle. From the Maya jungles of Central America, let us journey westward across the Pacific to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, where another great civilization rose and fell, leaving behind some of humanity's most impressive architectural achievements. The Khmer Empire, centered in what is now Cambodia, dominated mainland Southeast Asia from approximately 800 to 1450 CE. At its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, the empire controlled or influenced territories across modern Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. The Khmer capital at Angkor was perhaps the largest pre-industrial city in the world. Recent remote sensing using LiDAR technology has revealed that urban Angkor covered over 1,000 square kilometers. At its peak around 1200 CE, between 700,000 and 1 million people may have lived in the greater Angkor region. The monuments that remain testify to extraordinary achievement. Angkor Wat, built in the early 12th century by King Suryavarman II, is the largest religious structure ever constructed. The temple complex covers over 400 acres, with towers reaching more than 200 feet high. Its galleries contain thousands of square meters of intricate bas-relief carvings depicting Hindu mythology and Khmer history. But Angkor Wat is just one of hundreds of temples at Angkor, Bayon, with its enormous stone faces gazing in all directions. Taprome deliberately left partially consumed by jungle. Preah Khan, Neakpeen, Pre-Rup, temples stretching across the landscape, each representing enormous investments of labour, skill and resources. How did the Khmer Empire support such grandeur? The answer lies in an extraordinary feat of water engineering. The Khmer created one of the most sophisticated hydraulic civilizations in human history. Angkor sits in a challenging environment. The region experiences dramatic seasonal variation between wet and dry monsoons. The Tonle Sap Lake expands and contracts enormously with the seasons. The Siem Reap River and other waterways flood during wet season and diminish during dry season. Managing water was essential to supporting dense population and intensive agriculture. The Khmer solution was a massive system of reservoirs called barays, canals, moats and embankments. The West Baray is 8 kilometers long and 2.3 kilometers wide, capable of holding more than 40 million cubic meters of water. The East Baray was nearly as large. Dozens of smaller reservoirs dotted the landscape. This system served multiple purposes. The reservoirs collected and stored monsoon rainfall for use during the dry season. They controlled flooding, protecting fields and settlements. They supplied irrigation water for rice cultivation. They supported fish farming, providing protein. They filled temple moats, creating the sacred geographies represented in temple architecture. They may have been used for transportation via canals. The hydraulic system enabled intensive agriculture. Rice cultivation in Cambodia can produce multiple harvests per year with adequate water. The Khmer managed water flows to maximize agricultural productivity. Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan, who visited Angkor in 1296 to 1297, reported that the Khmer harvested rice 3 or 4 times annually. This agricultural surplus supported everything else: the royal court, the bureaucracy, the military, the priesthood, the artisans who built temples, the artists who carved reliefs, the merchants who traded across Southeast Asia. Angkor was a hydraulic civilization in the truest sense. Its power and prosperity flowed from water management. But this created vulnerability. The hydraulic system required constant maintenance. Canals silted up, embankments eroded, reservoirs filled with sediment. Left unattended, the system would fail. And maintenance required stable political authority, adequate labour, and sufficient resources. For centuries, the Khmer successfully maintained their water system. Kings built new reservoirs and temples, demonstrating their power and piety. The empire expanded, conquering neighbours and extracting tribute. Angkor grew to immense size. Trade flourished with China, India, and throughout Southeast Asia. But by the 14th century, multiple pressures were building. Climate records suggest that Southeast Asia experienced increasing variability in monsoon patterns during this period. Tree ring data from nearby regions indicates droughts punctuated by severe floods. The delicate balance of the hydraulic system became harder to maintain. Warfare intensified with the rising Thai kingdoms to the west and north. The Sukhothai and Ayutthaya kingdoms were expanding, challenging Khmer power. Military expeditions became more frequent and costly. Resources devoted to warfare reduced capacity for infrastructure maintenance. Theravada Buddhism was spreading through mainland Southeast Asia, gradually displacing the Hindu-Buddhist synthesis that had legitimized Khmer kingship. This religious transformation affected royal authority and the basis for temple construction. Resources that once went to building Hindu-Buddhist monuments shifted toward Theravada practices, emphasizing simpler monasteries and merit-making through charity. The hydraulic system began to fail. Archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence reveals the problems that accumulated. Sediment buildup in canals and reservoirs reduced their capacity. The infrastructure required to manage increasingly variable water flows wasn't adequately maintained. Erosion increased as deforestation, necessary for agriculture and construction, destabilized watersheds. LiDAR mapping has revealed something fascinating and troubling. The Khmer had covered much of the landscape around Angkor with hydraulic infrastructure, embankments, canals, reservoirs, roads. This represented enormous achievement, but also enormous ecological transformation. The natural hydrology of the region had been completely reorganized. This reorganization worked as long as it was maintained. But when maintenance faltered, the system became unstable. Floods could breach embankments designed to contain them. Droughts could empty reservoirs that had lost capacity to sedimentation. The infrastructure designed to control water could amplify natural variability if not properly managed. Evidence suggests this is what happened. Studies of sediment cores from Angkor's reservoirs show that the 14th and 15th centuries saw episodes of extreme erosion, suggesting severe floods overwhelming the system's capacity. The massive infrastructure meant to control water was failing. Agricultural productivity likely declined as the irrigation system deteriorated. Rice harvests would have decreased. Food supplies would have tightened. The surplus needed to support Angkor's enormous population would have shrunk. Famine may have struck. Political authority eroded as the king's ability to maintain the system and ensure prosperity failed. The Khmer political system, like the Maya, legitimized royal power through the king's role in maintaining cosmic order and earthly prosperity. When drought and flood undermined this prosperity, royal authority suffered. The Ayutthaya kingdom attacked Angkor repeatedly in the 15th century. In 1431, Ayutthaya forces captured Angkor, though Khmer kings later returned. In 1447, Angkor was taken again, and this time apparently sacked more thoroughly. Around 1450 or shortly after, the Khmer court abandoned Angkor, relocating to areas near present-day Phnom Penh. Why abandon Angkor? The traditional explanation emphasizes warfare with Ayutthaya, but the environmental evidence suggests deeper causes. The hydraulic system was failing. Climate variability was increasing. The enormous infrastructure that had enabled Angkor's rise had become a liability. Moreover, maritime trade was becoming increasingly important in Southeast Asia. Angkor sat inland, oriented toward agriculture and land-based power. Locations closer to the coast offered better access to growing maritime trade networks with China, India, and beyond. The geopolitical and economic center of gravity was shifting. The population of Angkor dispersed. Some followed the court to new capitals. Some remained in the area, but in smaller settlements. The great city that had housed perhaps 1 million people emptied. Without population to maintain them, the temples were gradually reclaimed by forest. But unlike the Maya cities, Angkor Wat itself was never completely abandoned. It converted to a Theravada Buddhist temple and maintained a community of monks. The temple remained a pilgrimage site. When Portuguese friar Antonio de Madalena visited in 1586, he found Angkor Wat still functioning as a Buddhist monastery, though the city around it had vanished. The Khmer Empire's collapse illustrates several familiar themes. A civilization achieved remarkable things through intensive environmental management. Population grew dense. The system became complex and interdependent. When environmental conditions became more variable and difficult, and when political and military pressures increased, the system proved fragile. The hydraulic infrastructure that enabled Angkor's rise became a vulnerability. The more elaborate it grew, the more maintenance it required. When that maintenance faltered, the entire system could fail. The Khmer had committed themselves to a strategy that demanded continuous success in environmental management. Climate played a crucial but not deterministic role. The droughts and floods of the 14th and 15th centuries created crisis, but human systems and choices shaped how that crisis unfolded. Different political structures, different resource management strategies, different priorities might have produced different outcomes. The Khmer case also shows how success can create vulnerability. The more elaborate the hydraulic system became, the more it required maintenance and the more catastrophic its failure could be. The population the system supported was larger than the land could sustain without that system. When the system failed, collapse followed. Yet again, we see that collapse doesn't mean ending. The Khmer people survived. Cambodian culture continued. The kingdom relocated and adapted. What collapsed was the particular configuration of power, settlement, and environmental management centered at Angkor. Let us move now from Southeast Asia's jungles to the arid lands of Mesopotamia to examine one of history's earliest empires, the Akkadian Empire, the first collapse. We must journey back now more than 4,000 years to the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, to what the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. Here, in the late 24th century BCE, a Semitic-speaking warrior named Sargon conquered the Sumerian city-states and established what many scholars consider the world's first empire, the Akkadian Empire. The story of Sargon's rise has legendary qualities. Later texts claim he was born in secret, placed in a basket of reeds, and floated down the river to be found and raised by a gardener. He became cupbearer to the king of Kish, then somehow seized power and began his conquests. Whether or not these details are accurate, what's clear is that Sargon, who ruled from approximately 2334 to 2279 BCE, unified Mesopotamia under single rule for the first time. He conquered the Sumerian cities of southern Mesopotamia, expanded north into Syria, campaigned east into Elam, and may have reached the Mediterranean coast. Sargon established his capital at Akkad, whose precise location remains unknown, but was probably near modern Baghdad. From there, he administered an empire covering perhaps 250,000 square kilometers and including all of Mesopotamia and beyond. This was unprecedented. Previously, Mesopotamia had been divided among competing city-states, each centered on its temple to a patron deity. Sargon created a unified state with centralized administration, standardized weights and measures, and Akkadian as an administrative language. The Akkadian Empire reached its peak under Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin, who ruled from about 2254 to 2218 BCE. Naram-Sin claimed divine status, calling himself God of Akkad, and depicting himself with the horned crown of divinity. He campaigned widely, fighting in the Zagros Mountains, Syria, and Anatolia. But Naram-Sin's reign also saw increasing pressures. Rebellions broke out repeatedly. His inscriptions speak of crushing revolts across the empire. The military effort required to maintain control was clearly intensifying. Then, around 2100 BCE, the Akkadian Empire collapsed suddenly and dramatically. Cities were abandoned, population declined sharply, the empire fragmented. A period of chaos ensued, sometimes called a Dark Age, before new powers emerged. For centuries, historians had various theories about what caused this collapse. Then, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, groundbreaking archaeological work revealed a surprising culprit: climate change. Harvey Weiss of Yale University and his team conducted paleoclimate studies in northern Mesopotamia. They excavated ancient sites including Tel Leilan in Syria, a major Akkadian provincial centre. What they found was startling. Around 2200 BCE, there's clear evidence of sudden and severe aridification. Sediment cores show a massive increase in wind-blown dust. Archaeological evidence shows widespread abandonment of settlements. Agricultural systems collapsed. The region experienced what appears to have been a mega-drought lasting 300 years or more. This wasn't a normal drought. Climate proxies suggest that rainfall may have decreased by up to 30 or 40%. For a civilization dependent on rain-fed agriculture in the north and irrigation from rivers fed by northern rainfall in the south, this was catastrophic. Tel Leilan itself was suddenly abandoned around 2200 BCE. The city had been a thriving regional centre with thousands of inhabitants. Archaeological excavation shows that occupants simply left. There's no evidence of warfare or destruction. People departed, and the city remained largely empty for the next 300 years. Similar patterns appear at sites across northern Mesopotamia and Syria. The entire agricultural system of the region collapsed as drought made farming impossible. The population either died or migrated southward toward the Tigris and Euphrates, which still flowed but at reduced levels. For the Akkadian Empire, this was devastating. The northern provinces, which had been rich agricultural lands paying tribute and supporting administrative centres, suddenly emptied. The resource base of the empire contracted sharply. Southern Mesopotamia, dependent on irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates, fared somewhat better but still suffered. Reduced river flows meant less water for irrigation. Agricultural yields declined. Food became scarcer. The political consequences were swift. An empire is ultimately a system for extracting and redistributing resources. When those resources disappear, the system fails. The Akkadian state couldn't feed its armies, couldn't pay its administrators, couldn't maintain control over far-flung territories. Rebellions that Naram-Sin had suppressed with difficulty became impossible to contain. Regional governors declared independence. Nomadic groups from the mountains and deserts, themselves suffering from drought, raided and invaded. The empire fragmented. Later, Mesopotamian texts preserve memories of this catastrophe. The Curse of Akkad, a Sumerian poem written perhaps 2 centuries after the events, describes divine punishment brought upon Akkad for Naram, Sin's hubris in claiming divinity. The gods send drought, famine, and invasion to destroy the empire. The poem says, "For the first time since cities were built and founded, the great agricultural tracts produce no grain, the inundated tracts produce no fish, the irrigated orchards produced neither syrup nor wine, the gathered clouds did not rain, the vegetation did not grow." This is clearly describing severe drought. The Curse of Akkad is mythologized history, but it preserves accurate memory of environmental catastrophe. The Akkadian collapse was rapid. Within perhaps 20 to 30 years, a functioning empire disintegrated into competing warlords and empty cities. Population in the Akkadian heartland may have declined by 3/4 or more, but this wasn't the end of Mesopotamian civilization. After a period of fragmentation called the Gutian period, new Sumerian dynasties arose, particularly the 3rd dynasty of Ur around 2100 BCE. Mesopotamian civilization recovered, adapted, and continued for thousands more years. What the Akkadian collapse teaches us is how vulnerable even powerful empires can be to environmental change. The Akkadian Empire was the most powerful political organization of its time, commanding armies that campaigned across the Near East. Yet a shift in climate patterns was enough to destroy it. Importantly, the collapse wasn't simply the direct effect of drought. Rather, drought destabilized the political and economic systems that held the empire together. Food scarcity led to social unrest. Resource scarcity made it impossible to maintain military control. Regional authorities broke away when central power weakened. The Akkadian case also demonstrates that collapse can be relatively rapid. From apparent peak under Naram-Sin to imperial disintegration was perhaps only a generation or 2. Complex systems can unravel quickly when key supports fail. Finally, Akkad shows that civilizations can recover from collapse. Mesopotamia didn't remain a wasteland. New political formations emerged. Cities were rebuilt or new ones founded. Culture and knowledge continued. The collapse was a transformation, not an ending. Let us rest here for a moment, contemplating this ancient empire whose very capital has vanished beneath the sands, before moving to another early civilization whose fate remains shrouded in mystery. The Indus Valley Civilization, an enigmatic end. Around the same time that Mesopotamia was developing its city-states and Egypt was building pyramids, another great civilization flourished in South Asia. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization after one of its major cities, developed along the Indus River and its tributaries in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. This civilization is remarkable in many ways, and its collapse or transformation remains one of archaeology's great puzzles. We'll explore what we know, what we don't know, and what it all might mean. The Indus civilization emerged around 3300 BCE and reached its peak between 2600 and 1900 BCE. At its height, it was the most extensive of the ancient civilizations, covering over 1 million square kilometers, larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. The civilization included hundreds of settlements, from small villages to major cities. The largest cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, housed populations estimated at 30 to 40,000 each. Smaller but still significant urban centres included Dolavira, Kalibangan, Rakigahi and Lothal. What makes the Indus civilization fascinating is its apparent uniformity and organisation. Unlike Mesopotamia with its competing city-states, or Egypt with its divine pharaohs and monumental tombs, Indus cities show remarkably standardized features, but little evidence of powerful rulers or great social hierarchy. The cities were carefully planned with rectilinear street grids. Buildings were constructed of standardized fired bricks whose size ratios remained consistent across the civilization. Sophisticated drainage systems carried wastewater from houses through covered drains in streets to disposal areas. Many houses had bathing platforms connected to the drainage network. Public architecture included large granaries, platforms that may have served assembly functions, and structures called great baths that may have had ritual significance. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro is particularly impressive, a watertight pool built of precisely fitted bricks surrounded by columned galleries and changing rooms. But here's what's strange and significant. There are no obvious palaces or temples, no structures that clearly mark the residence of a king or the dwelling place of a god. No monumental tombs filled with treasures. The architecture suggests organization and planning, but not the glorification of rulers that we see in Egypt or Mesopotamia. The Indus people produced standardized weights and measures. They created a writing system preserved on thousands of seals and other objects. They engaged in extensive trade with Indus goods found as far as Mesopotamia and artifacts from distant regions found in Indus cities. Craftsmanship was sophisticated. Metallurgy in bronze and copper was advanced. Bead-making reached high levels of skill, with carnelian beads requiring complex drilling and heating techniques. Pottery was mass-produced, but of good quality. Seal carving produced miniature masterpieces depicting animals and symbols. Agriculture supported this urban civilization. The Indus region benefited from annual flooding that deposited fertile silt, similar to Egypt's Nile floods. Farmers grew wheat, barley, dates, melons, and other crops. They may have been the first to cultivate cotton. Animal husbandry included cattle, sheep, goats, and water buffalo. For 6 or 7 centuries, this civilization flourished and remained remarkably stable. The standardization of weights, measures, and brick sizes persisted over time and space. The urban planning principles remained consistent. The writing system didn't change substantially. Then, around 1900 BCE, the civilization transformed. This transformation is sometimes called the Indus Collapse, though what exactly happened remains debated and mysterious. What's clear is that the great cities declined. Mohenjo-Daro shows evidence of declining maintenance and haphazard construction, replacing the earlier careful planning. Building quality decreased. The drainage systems weren't maintained. Squatters occupied formerly grand structures. Harappa shows similar patterns. The careful urban planning broke down. Standardization decreased. The uniformity that characterized the civilization fragmented into regional variations. Many Indus sites were abandoned entirely. Surveys show dramatic decrease in settlement numbers and sizes. Population appears to have declined significantly in the Indus heartland. The script disappeared. After 1900 BCE, we no longer find Indus writing. This suggests either that literacy ended or that the writing system ceased being used for the public, administrative, or commercial purposes it had served. Long-distance trade diminished. The commercial networks that connected the Indus region to Mesopotamia and other distant areas contracted. The Indus seals and goods that had appeared in Mesopotamia during the peak period no longer show up in the archaeological record. But, and this is important, this wasn't a sudden catastrophic collapse. It was a gradual transformation over several centuries. Some Indus sites continued occupation, though in modified form. The population didn't disappear. It dispersed and reorganized. What caused this transformation? This is where the mystery deepens, because we lack the textual evidence that helps us understand other collapses. The Indus script remains undeciphered, so we have no contemporary written accounts. We must rely entirely on archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence. For many years, invasion was the favoured explanation. When the Indus civilization was first discovered in the 1920s, scholars noted that Indo-Aryan peoples speaking Sanskrit appeared in South Asia sometime after the Indus decline. The Rig Veda, the oldest Indo-Aryan text, contains references to destroying fortifications and fighting dark-skinned enemies. This led to theories of Aryan invasion destroying the Indus cities. However, this theory has largely been abandoned. There's little archaeological evidence of violent destruction at most Indus sites. No evidence of massacres or conquering armies. The transformation appears gradual and complex, not the result of sudden military conquest. Climate change emerges as a more likely major factor. Paleoclimate research in South Asia reveals significant changes around 2000 to 1900 BCE. Multiple lines of evidence point toward weakening of the summer monsoon that brings most of the region's rainfall. The monsoon system depends on temperature differentials between ocean and land. Changes in these differentials can weaken monsoon intensity. Evidence suggests this occurred in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Reduced monsoon rainfall would have meant reduced river flows, reduced flooding, and reduced agricultural productivity. For a civilization dependent on agriculture, particularly agriculture relying on annual floods, weakened monsoons would have been catastrophic. Crop yields would have declined, food supplies would have tightened. The urban populations dependent on agricultural surplus would have become unsustainable. There's also evidence of tectonic changes affecting the Indus River itself. The region is seismically active. Earthquakes may have altered river courses, potentially even creating temporary dams that disrupted the flood regime and navigation. Some scholars point to evidence that the Sarasvati River, mentioned in the Rig Veda, and possibly corresponding to the now dry Gagahakra river system where many Indus sites cluster, may have dried up or dramatically reduced flow around this time. loss of a major river would have been devastating for settlements dependent on it. So the picture that emerges is of environmental change, probably climate-driven and possibly complicated by tectonic events, undermining the agricultural and hydrological systems supporting Indus urbanism. But environmental change alone may not fully explain the transformation. Social and political factors likely played roles. The Indus civilization's apparent lack of strong centralized authority and obvious military organization might have been a vulnerability when crisis struck. Without powerful rulers commanding resources for relief or adaptation, without military forces maintaining order, without clear hierarchies organizing response to crisis, Indus society may have fragmented when environmental stress appeared. The very egalitarianism that seems to have characterized the civilization may have made coordinated response difficult. The trade networks that had flourished also created vulnerability. When climate change affected multiple regions simultaneously, and evidence suggests the early 2nd millennium BCE saw climate shifts across Asia and the Near East, trade partners weakened or collapsed, cascading back to affect the Indus cities. The result was de-urbanization. People left the cities and dispersed into smaller, village-based communities. The complex social organization, specialized crafts, long-distance trade, writing, and standardization that characterized the mature Harappan phase gave way to simpler, more localized, late Harappan cultures. But this wasn't extinction. Indus people didn't vanish. Many cultural elements continued in modified form. Pottery styles evolved from Harappan forms. Architectural techniques persisted. Agricultural practices continued. The population remained, though reorganized and dispersed. Some scholars argue this wasn't really collapse, but adaptation. The urban civilization couldn't sustain itself in changing conditions, so people adapted by returning to village life that could be maintained with reduced resources. From this perspective, the transformation was actually successful adaptation to environmental change. In the centuries after 1900 BCE, Indo-Aryan peoples gradually became dominant in northern South Asia, bringing Sanskrit language and Vedic culture. But these peoples likely mixed with local populations, including descendants of Indus people. Modern South Asian populations carry genetic heritage from both groups. The Indus collapse teaches us several things. First, even sophisticated civilizations can prove fragile when their environmental foundations shift. The Indus cities were marvels of planning and organization, but they rested on agricultural systems vulnerable to climate change. Second, collapse doesn't require warfare or violent destruction. The Indus transformation appears to have been mostly peaceful, a gradual fading rather than dramatic catastrophe. Cities can empty without being destroyed. Third, the mystery itself is instructive. Without written records, we can interpret. Enormous aspects of Indus civilization remain unknown. We don't fully understand their political organization, their religion, their language, their literature. When a civilization fades and doesn't leave readable texts, even their greatest achievements can become puzzles to posterity. Finally, transformation isn't ending. The people and many cultural elements continued. What ended was a particular form of social organization, the urban, literate, trade-oriented civilization. What continued was human life, community, and adaptation. Let us pause here, contemplating these mysterious cities with their undeciphered writing, before we journey westward to another collapsed empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. From superpower to oblivion. We return now to Mesopotamia, but more than 1,000 years after the Akkadian collapse. By the early 1st millennium BCE, the Near East was dominated by a military superpower whose name became synonymous with might and terror, Assyria. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which reached its peak in the 7th century BCE, was perhaps the most effective military machine the ancient world had yet produced. At its height under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, the empire stretched from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from Anatolia to the Arabian desert. This was an empire built on and maintained by military power. The Assyrian army was the most advanced of its era, featuring professional soldiers, cavalry, siege engines, and sophisticated logistics. Assyrian kings campaigned almost annually, conquering cities, extracting tribute, and deporting rebellious populations. The Assyrians developed a fearsome reputation. Their own royal inscriptions boasted of brutal treatments of defeated enemies, impalement, flaying, mutilation, mass deportations. Whether exaggerated for propaganda effect or not, these texts reveal how Assyria used terror as a tool of empire. But Assyria was more than just military might. The empire developed sophisticated administration, dividing territories into provinces governed by appointed officials. It created road networks and postal systems, enabling communication across vast distances. It sponsored art and literature, leaving us magnificent palace reliefs and the great library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. Nineveh, the Assyrian capital from Sennacherib's reign onward, was one of the ancient world's great cities. Enormous city walls stretched nearly 12 kilometers. The population may have exceeded 100,000. Royal palaces featured elaborate gardens, possibly the famous Hanging Gardens, later misattributed to Babylon. Libraries contained thousands of cuneiform tablets preserving Mesopotamian literature and knowledge. At its peak in the mid-7th century BCE, under Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian Empire seemed invincible. Ashurbanipal's armies campaigned from Elam in the east to Egypt in the west. The king styled himself King of the World and portrayed his power as unlimited. Yet, within a generation of Ashurbanipal's death, around 627 BCE, the entire empire had collapsed. By 612 BCE, Assyria's capital cities were destroyed, its empire dissolved, and its ruling class eliminated so thoroughly that Assyrian culture essentially disappeared. This collapse was remarkably swift and complete. Assyria went from superpower to non-existence in roughly 15 years. How did this happen? The proximate cause was military defeat by a coalition of enemies. The Babylonians under Nabopolassar allied with the Medes from Iran and possibly with Scythian nomads. This coalition attacked Assyria systematically. In 614 BCE, the coalition captured Ashur, Assyria's ancient religious capital. In 612 BCE, they besieged and destroyed Nineveh. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, preserved traditions of Nineveh's fall, describing a massive flood breaching the city's defences, followed by assault and burning. Archaeological evidence confirms that Nineveh was violently destroyed. The last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, fled westward to Haran and tried to maintain resistance with Egyptian help. But in 609 BCE, the coalition captured Haran. Assyria ceased to exist as a political entity. The question is not how Assyria fell militarily, that's clear enough. The question is why this empire that had dominated the Near East for over a century suddenly proved so vulnerable. Part of the answer lies in imperial overextension. The Assyrian Empire was vast, but maintaining it required constant military effort. Garrison towns had to be supplied, rebellions had to be suppressed, borders had to be defended. This was enormously expensive in resources and manpower. The Assyrians had developed mass deportation as a control strategy, moving conquered populations away from their homelands to break resistance and provide labour. But this created problems. The deportees had little loyalty and required watching. The disrupted regions took time to recover productivity. The policy may have actually reduced the empire's economic base, even as it expanded territory. The military itself consumed huge resources. Professional soldiers required pay, equipment needed manufacture and maintenance, campaigns demanded supplies. The royal inscriptions boasting of annual campaigns actually reveal the burden the empire had to keep conquering to maintain itself. By the late 7th century BCE, Assyria may have been economically strained. The agricultural base supporting the empire may have been insufficient for the costs of administration and defense. Some scholars suggest the economy was over-militarized, with too many resources devoted to warfare and insufficient investment in productive capacity. Political succession was another vulnerability. After Ashurbanipal's death around 627 BCE, Assyria experienced civil war between rival claimants. This civil strife at the center weakened the empire's ability to respond to external threats. While Assyrians fought each other, their enemies organized against them. The Babylonians had long resented Assyrian dominance. Babylonia was culturally prestigious, the source of Mesopotamian learning and religion, but politically subordinate to Assyria. Multiple times Babylon had rebelled, and each time Assyria had crushed the rebellion, sometimes destroying the city. This resentment became a mobilizing force. The Medes were a rising power in Iran, consolidating previously fragmented Iranian peoples into a kingdom capable of challenging Assyria. The Median alliance with Babylon created a two-front threat that Assyria struggled to counter. There may have been environmental factors as well, though evidence is less clear than for other collapses we've examined. Some climate proxies suggest drought conditions in the late 7th century BCE. If agricultural productivity declined, this would have compounded economic and political stresses. What's remarkable about Assyria's fall is its completeness. The Babylonians and Medes didn't just defeat Assyria, they annihilated it. The major Assyrian cities were destroyed so thoroughly that some weren't reoccupied for centuries. The Assyrian ruling class was apparently eliminated. Assyrian language and culture largely disappeared, absorbed into Babylonian culture. This thoroughness probably reflects how hated Assyria was. The empire had been built on terror and maintained through force. When power collapsed, victims took revenge. The complete destruction of Nineveh and other cities suggests systematic effort to erase Assyrian power. The prophets of Israel and Judah, who had experienced Assyrian conquest, celebrated the empire's fall. The biblical book of Nahum is essentially one long poem rejoicing in Nineveh's destruction. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims, it proclaims, before describing Nineveh's complete ruin. From Assyria's ruins, the Babylonians created their own empire. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, the Neo-Babylonian Empire briefly dominated the Near East, conquering Jerusalem and creating the famous Hanging Gardens. But this empire too would fall within a generation to the Persians under Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE. The Assyrian collapse demonstrates how military power alone cannot sustain empire indefinitely. Economic capacity must support military ambition. Political legitimacy matters. Empires built purely on terror may inspire effective resistance when they weaken. Imperial overextension creates vulnerability to coordinated opposition. And most fundamentally, even the mightiest military powers can collapse with shocking rapidity when multiple factors converge. Let us rest here, contemplating how completely one of antiquity's greatest empires vanished, before moving forward in time to examine an Islamic empire's transformation, the Abbasid Caliphate, the golden age that faded. We jump forward now more than a millennium, from ancient Mesopotamia to medieval Iraq. But we remain in some of the same territory, because in the 8th through 10th centuries CE, Baghdad was the center of the Islamic world and arguably the most sophisticated civilization on earth. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled from 750 to 1258 CE, presided over what's often called the Islamic Golden Age. This was a period of extraordinary intellectual, scientific and cultural achievement, but it was also a period that saw the Caliphate's real power gradually erode, even as Islamic civilization flourished. The Abbasids came to power through revolution. They overthrew the Umayyad dynasty, which had ruled the Islamic world from Damascus since 661 CE. The Abbasid Revolution claimed to restore true Islamic governance and promised a more inclusive empire less dominated by Arab elites. The second Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mansur, founded Baghdad in 762 CE. The choice of location was strategic, at the crossroads of trade routes on the Tigris River, in the heart of the former Sasanian Persian Empire, whose administrative traditions the Abbasids adopted. Baghdad quickly became one of the world's great cities. By the 9th century, its population may have reached 1 million or more, making it possibly the largest city in the world outside China. The round city at Baghdad's core represented the center of the Islamic world, with the Caliph's palace and the Great Mosque at its heart. The early Abbasid period saw remarkable cultural and intellectual flourishing. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a center for translation and scholarship, where Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit texts were translated into Arabic. Islamic scholars built on and extended Greek mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra. The word itself comes from the title of his book Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala. Al-Razi and Ibn Sina made medical advances that would influence European medicine for centuries. Al-Battani's astronomical observations achieved remarkable precision. Scholars in Abbasid courts preserved and extended the knowledge of ancient civilizations. Literature flowered. The stories of 1001 Nights reflect the cosmopolitan culture of Abbasid Baghdad. Poetry reached refined heights. Calligraphy developed into high art. Architecture produced elegant mosques and palaces, though unfortunately few Abbasid buildings survive. The Abbasid economy was sophisticated. Baghdad sat at the center of trade routes connecting Europe, Africa, India, Central Asia, and China. Gold from Africa, silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, goods from across the known world flowed through Islamic ports and markets. Agriculture benefited from advanced irrigation techniques inherited from earlier Mesopotamian and Persian systems. The Abbasids maintained and extended canal networks in Iraq, enabling intensive cultivation. Agricultural manuals compiled knowledge of crops, irrigation, and farming techniques. The caliphs themselves patronized art, science, and culture. Harun al-Rashid, who ruled from 786 to 809, became legendary for his wealth and magnificence. His court attracted scholars, poets, and artists. His reign represented the Abbasid Caliphate at its most powerful and prosperous. But even during this golden age, the seeds of political fragmentation were growing. The Abbasid Empire was vast, stretching from North Africa to Central Asia. Governing such territory from Baghdad proved increasingly difficult. Distance and slow communication meant that provincial governors exercised considerable autonomy. As long as they paid tribute and acknowledged the caliph's authority, they functioned as independent rulers. Over time, these governors began establishing their own dynasties, becoming kings in all but name. In the mid-9th century, the caliphs began losing direct control of provinces. The Tahirids established autonomous rule in Khorasan in 821. The Saffarids took over eastern Iran in the 860s. The Tulunids made Egypt effectively independent in 868. The pattern repeated across the empire. The caliphs maintained nominal sovereignty. These breakaway dynasties usually acknowledged the caliph as spiritual leader of the Islamic world and had their rule legitimized by caliphal decree. But real power shifted away from Baghdad. Military factors contributed to this fragmentation. The Abbasids relied increasingly on Turkish slave soldiers called Mamluks. These elite troops were effective warriors, but developed their own power bases. Mamluk commanders became kingmakers, installing and removing caliphs at will. In 945, the Boyids, a dynasty from northern Iran, actually conquered Baghdad and reduced the Abbasid Caliph to a figurehead. The Boyids were Shiites, while the Abbasids were Sunni, adding religious tension to political domination. For over a century, the caliphs reigned but didn't rule, maintained for legitimacy, while real power lay with military strongmen. Economic factors also played a role in caliphal decline. The sophisticated irrigation agriculture of Iraq proved fragile. The canal systems required constant maintenance. Neglect led to silting, salinization, and land degradation. Political instability and warfare disrupted maintenance. Studies of Iraqi agriculture show a long-term decline beginning in the 9th century and accelerating through the 10th and 11th centuries. As agricultural productivity declined, so did the tax base supporting the caliphate. Less revenue meant less capacity to maintain administration and military, creating a vicious cycle. Climate may have played a role. Some evidence suggests that the Islamic world experienced cooling and drying trends in the later 1st millennium CE. Reduced rainfall would have strained both rain-fed and irrigated agriculture, though the evidence is not as clear as for some other collapses. Environmental stress may have compounded political and economic problems. The 11th century brought new invasions from the Central Asian steppes. Turkish peoples, including the Seljuks, moved into the Islamic world. In 1055, the Seljuk Turks conquered Baghdad. Like the Buyids before them, the Seljuks reduced the Abbasid caliphs to figureheads, though the Seljuks were Sunni and claimed to be restoring proper Islamic rule. The Seljuks established an empire stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia, nominally governed in the caliph's name, but actually ruled by Seljuk sultans. The caliphs remained as religious leaders and sources of legitimacy, but exercised no real political or military power. Then came the Mongols. In 1258, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, besieged Baghdad with a massive Mongol army. The last effective Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, apparently misjudged the threat. When the city fell, the Mongols sacked it thoroughly. Accounts describe horrific slaughter. Estimates range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands killed. The Mongols destroyed much of the city, including libraries, palaces, and mosques. The House of Wisdom was burned, and according to tradition, so many books were thrown into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink. Al-Mustasim was executed, wrapped in a carpet, and trampled by horses, according to one account, to avoid spilling royal blood directly. The Abbasid Caliphate as a political entity ended. However, a member of the Abbasid family escaped to Cairo, where the Mamluk rulers of Egypt established a shadow caliphate. This Abbasid line continued in Cairo until 1517, when the Ottoman Turks conquered Egypt. But these later Abbasids were purely symbolic figureheads with no real authority. The fall of Baghdad to the Mongols was catastrophic for Iraq specifically. The city's population plummeted. The irrigation systems were neglected or deliberately destroyed. Agriculture collapsed. Iraq entered a long decline from which it wouldn't recover for centuries. But for Islamic civilization more broadly, 1258 wasn't an ending. The Islamic world continued to flourish in other centers. Cairo under the Mamluks, Damascus, and later Istanbul under the Ottomans became new centers of Islamic power and culture. Islamic science, art, and literature continued to develop. The Mongols themselves converted to Islam within a few generations. The Ilkhanate that ruled Iran and Iraq became Islamic and Persian culturally. Islamic civilization proved more durable than any particular political structure. The Abbasid decline teaches us several lessons. First, political fragmentation doesn't necessarily mean cultural or civilizational collapse. Islamic civilization flourished even as the caliphate fragmented politically. Science, art, literature, and trade continued across a politically divided Islamic world. Second, military power by itself doesn't guarantee political control. The caliphs lost real authority long before they lost their title, becoming figureheads maintained for legitimacy, while military strongmen held actual power. Third, agricultural decline can undermine even wealthy empires. The degradation of Iraqi irrigation agriculture eroded the economic base supporting Baghdad's dominance, contributing to the shift of power to other centers. Fourth, Empires can prove remarkably fragile to determined external attack. The Mongols destroyed in weeks what had taken centuries to build. The Abbasid political structure, already weakened by fragmentation, couldn't resist the most effective military force of the medieval period. Finally, civilization can survive political collapse. Islamic culture, knowledge, and religion continued and flourished long after the Abbasid Caliphate ended. What ended was a particular political organization, not the civilization itself. Let us pause here, imagining the great libraries of Baghdad burning, before we turn to examine the Mongol Empire itself, the greatest land empire in human history and its eventual fragmentation. The Mongol Empire, unity and fragmentation. The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history. At its peak in the late 13th century, it stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, encompassing perhaps 100 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's population at the time. This empire was created in a single lifetime through the military genius and ruthless will of one man, Genghis Khan. Born as Temujin around 1162 into a minor noble family on the Mongolian steppes, he unified the quarrelling Mongol tribes, conquered vast territories, and died in 1227, ruling an empire stretching from China to the Caspian Sea. The Mongols were nomadic pastoralists from the steppes of Central Asia. Their society was organized around herding horses, sheep, goats, and cattle across seasonal pastures. They lived in portable felt tents called jurs or yurts. Their mobility and horsemanship made them formidable warriors. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols developed the most effective military system of the medieval period. Every man was a soldier and a horseman. The army was organized decimally, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Discipline was strict. Tactics were sophisticated, including feigned retreats, coordinated movements, and rapid concentration of forces. The Mongols were masters of psychological warfare. They cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness toward cities that resisted, but clemency toward those that surrendered. Entire populations were massacred to encourage others to submit without fighting. This terror was systematic policy. But the Mongols were more than just destructive. They established the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, across Eurasia, facilitating trade and communication on an unprecedented scale. The Silk Roads flourished under Mongol protection. Merchants could travel from Europe to China with relative safety. Ideas, technologies, and goods flowed across the empire. The Mongols were pragmatic rulers. They adopted religions freely. Genghis Khan proclaimed religious tolerance. They used local administrators to govern conquered peoples. They patronized arts and crafts. They established postal systems enabling rapid communication across vast distances. Under Mongol rule, paper money was used, census systems were established, and legal codes were promulgated. But this empire, like all empires, contained the seeds of its own fragmentation. The Mongol tradition divided inheritance among sons. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire was divided among his 4 sons, though under the nominal supremacy of his third son, Ogadai, as Great Khan. Initially, this system worked. Ogadai ruled from Karakoram in Mongolia as Great Khan, while his brothers governed appanages in Central Asia, Russia, and other regions. The Mongol conquests continued, with European campaigns in the early 1240s and the conquest of Baghdad in 1258. But as generations passed and the empire grew, coordination became difficult. The different branches of the Mongol royal family developed their own interests, their own conflicts, their own priorities. Geographic distance made unity hard to maintain. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had effectively fragmented into four major khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in the Middle East. These khanates sometimes cooperated, but increasingly acted as independent states. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, lasted from 1271 to 1368. Kublai moved the capital to Beijing, adopted Chinese administrative practices, and ruled as a Chinese emperor, though maintaining Mongol identity and reserving high offices for Mongols and their allies. Yuan China was prosperous and culturally vibrant. Trade flourished. Marco Polo's famous travels occurred during this period, bringing European knowledge of China to new heights. Technology advanced. But the Yuan also faced challenges, maintaining Mongol identity while ruling a Chinese empire, managing ethnic tensions, dealing with floods and famines. The Yuan dynasty ended in the mid-14th century. A combination of factors brought it down. Massive flooding of the Yellow River in the 1340s, which the government handled poorly, leading to famine and economic collapse. Increased taxation to fund expensive military campaigns and lavish court spending. Growing Chinese resentment of Mongol rule and ethnic discrimination. Factional conflict within the Mongol ruling class. And finally, widespread rebellions, including the Red Turban Rebellion that eventually brought the Ming dynasty to power in 1368. The Golden Horde, which ruled Russia and the Western Steppes, lasted longer, but also eventually fragmented. The Golden Horde converted to Islam in the early 14th century, distinguishing itself religiously from the other khanates. It extracted tribute from Russian principalities while allowing them considerable autonomy. But by the 15th century, the Golden Horde was fragmenting into rival khanates: Kazan, Crimea, Astrakhan, Sibir, and others. The Crimean Khanate lasted until conquered by Russia in 1783, making it the longest surviving Mongol state. The Ilkhanate in the Middle East lasted from roughly 1256 to 1353. It converted to Islam in 1295 under Ghazan Khan. The Ilkhanate patronized Persian culture and art, producing magnificent illustrated manuscripts and architecture. But succession struggles, economic problems, and the Black Death in the 1340s weakened it. By 1353, it had dissolved into rival regional powers. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia survived the longest in some form, but fragmented into western and eastern portions. The eastern portion eventually became the base for Tamerlane, Timur, who in the late 14th century attempted to recreate the Mongol Empire through conquest. Though his empire didn't survive his death in 1405, why did the Mongol Empire fragment? Several factors combined. First, the traditional Mongol inheritance system divided territory among heirs, creating multiple centers of power. Second, the empire was simply too large to govern as a single unit with medieval communication and transportation. Third, the different regions had different cultures, economies, and challenges requiring different policies. What worked in China didn't work in Russia. Fourth, the Mongols were always a small minority ruling vast populations. As they settled into their conquered territories, they adopted local cultures and religions, diverging from each other. The Yuan emperors became Chinese culturally. The Golden Horde became Islamic and Turkish influenced. The Ilkhanate became Persian culturally. Fifth, there was no clear succession system. Mongol tradition emphasized election of the Khan by nobles, but this led to disputes. Rival claimants fought civil wars. These conflicts weakened the empire and prevented unified action. Sixth, environmental factors may have played a role. The 14th century saw significant climate cooling globally. Plague struck repeatedly, including the Black Death that killed perhaps a third of Eurasia's population in the 1340s. These environmental shocks hit an already fragmenting empire. Finally, resistance from conquered peoples never entirely ceased. Rebellions in China, Russia, and the Middle East eventually succeeded. The Mongols were effective conquerors, but less effective at establishing durable governing systems that could outlast their military superiority. The Mongol Empire's fragmentation illustrates how even the mightiest military conquests don't necessarily create lasting political unity. Geographic extent, cultural diversity, succession problems, and the challenge of governing conquered peoples all contributed to fragmentation. Yet, the Mongol legacy endured. The states that succeeded the Mongol Empire, the Ming dynasty in China, the Muscovy Principality, later Russia, various Turkish and Persian states, all bore Mongol influence in administration, military organization, and political culture. The trade routes and connections established under Mongol rule persisted. The biological and technological exchanges of the Mongol period, for better and worse, as plague spread along with goods and ideas, reshaped Eurasia. The Mongol story reminds us that empires built purely on military conquest struggle to maintain cohesion once that conquest ends. Without shared culture, religion, language, or political tradition, only force holds the empire together. When that force weakens or divides, fragmentation follows. Let us rest here, contemplating the vast steppe empire that connected east and west, before turning to examine one more significant collapse, the Western Roman Empire revisited, the 5 stages of decline. We return now to Rome, but with fresh eyes informed by all we've examined. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is worth revisiting with a more structured analysis, because it exemplifies how complex systems collapse through interconnected stages. Historians sometimes divide Rome's decline into 5 overlapping phases, each characterized by particular problems that compounded the next phase's difficulties. This isn't a perfect categorization. History doesn't divide neatly, but it helps us understand the process. Phase 1, the 3rd century crisis, 235 to 284 CE. This period saw the Roman system nearly collapse entirely. In just 50 years, at least 50 individuals claimed the imperial title. Most reigned briefly before being killed in battle, assassinated, or overthrown. The empire fragmented into competing states. The economy spiraled into hyperinflation. Germanic and Persian enemies attacked repeatedly. The causes were multiple. The military had become powerful enough to make and unmake emperors. Any general with a loyal army could bid for power. The lack of clear succession rules meant that force determined who ruled. Civil wars became nearly constant. The currency collapsed as emperors debased silver coinage to pay soldiers. Where earlier denarii had been nearly pure silver, by the late 3rd century they were perhaps 5% silver. Inflation ravaged the economy. Fixed prices and wages became meaningless. Trade contracted. Cities struggled. External pressures intensified. The Sasanian Persian Empire, established in 224, was far more formidable than previous Persian states. In 260, the Persians actually captured the Roman Emperor Valerian, an unprecedented humiliation. Germanic peoples were consolidating into larger confederations and attacking in coordinated campaigns. Plague struck repeatedly. The plague of Cyprian in 249 to 262 killed enormous numbers, possibly including 20,000 per day at Rome itself at the plague's height. The disease's identity is debated, possibly smallpox, measles, or viral hemorrhagic fever, but its impact is clear. Population decline reduced the tax base and military recruitment. The empire survived this crisis through the efforts of strong military emperors, particularly Aurelian, 270 to 275, who reunified the empire, and Diocletian, 284 to 305, who completely restructured the imperial system. But the empire that emerged was fundamentally different from the earlier Principate. Phase 2, Late Roman Transformation, 284 to 378 CE. Diocletian's reforms transformed Rome into a more authoritarian, militarized, bureaucratic state. The empire was divided into eastern and western halves, each ruled by a senior Augustus and a junior Caesar. The army was enlarged to perhaps 600,000 soldiers. The bureaucracy expanded massively. These changes stabilized the empire, but at great cost. Tax burdens increased dramatically to support the larger military and administration. The economy became more controlled and regimented. Occupations became hereditary and enforced. Peasants were tied to the land as coloni, semi-free labourers obligated to remain on estates. Constantine, 306 to 337, continued these trends while adding religious transformation. His conversion to Christianity and subsequent imperial favour for the Church created a new alliance between Christian Church and Roman state. Constantinople, founded in 330, became a second capital rivaling Rome itself. This period saw cultural transformation. Classical paganism gradually gave way to Christianity. Traditional Roman civic culture declined as the empire became more militarized and bureaucratic. The sophisticated monetized economy partially gave way to payment in kind and more localized exchange. Yet this was also a period of stability and even prosperity in many regions. The frontiers were generally secure. Great building projects continued. Cities remained vibrant. The worst seemed to have passed. But fundamental weaknesses remained and would be exposed by new pressures. Phase 3, the Gothic Wars and Frontier Collapse, 378 to 450 CE. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 marked a turning point. Gothic refugees fleeing Hunnic pressure had been allowed to settle within the empire, but were mistreated. They rebelled, and in the ensuing battle killed the Eastern Emperor Valens and destroyed much of his army. Adrianople revealed that barbarian warriors, particularly Gothic cavalry, could defeat Roman armies in open battle. The Romans had lost their assumed military superiority. Barbarian peoples increasingly settled within Roman territory, maintaining their own military organizations and leaders. This began a process of barbarization, where Germanic peoples became Roman soldiers, commanders, and power brokers, while Romans became dependent on barbarian military force. By the early 5th century, Germanic generals were the real power behind puppet emperors in the West. The Rhine frontier collapsed in 406 when a massive group of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine and swept through Gaul. The Western Empire couldn't expel them. These groups moved on to Spain and, in the Vandals' case, to North Africa, where they captured Carthage in 439. Britain was abandoned around 410 as Roman administration and military withdrew, leaving the province to local defenders who faced Saxon, Pictish, and Irish raids. Gaul fragmented among various Germanic kingdoms. Spain fell under Visigothic control. Rome itself was sacked by Visigoths under Alaric in 410, the first time the city had fallen to foreign enemies in 800 years, and by Vandals in 455. These weren't just military defeats, but psychological shocks that shattered Roman confidence. Phase 4, Economic and Social Collapse, 400 to 476 CE. As the Western Empire fragmented politically, economic and social systems deteriorated. The sophisticated Roman economy had depended on Mediterranean-wide trade, specialized regional production, and monetary exchange. As territories broke away and warfare disrupted routes, this system contracted. North Africa, which had been the breadbasket of Rome, was lost to the Vandals. Grain shipments ceased. Rome's population, which had once reached 1 million, contracted to perhaps 30,000 or less. The great city emptied. Tax revenue collapsed as provinces were lost and economic productivity declined. The Western imperial government couldn't pay its soldiers or maintain administration. What remained of the army was essentially Germanic federate troops who owed loyalty to their own chiefs rather than to Rome. Urban culture declined throughout the West. Cities shrank, sometimes to a fraction of their earlier size. The complex economy supporting urban life, specialized craftsmen, merchants, professionals, couldn't sustain itself with reduced trade and wealth. People returned to simpler, more rural, more localized ways of life. Literacy declined as the educational system that had produced literate administrators, lawyers, and merchants fragmented. Why invest in classical education when career prospects for educated professionals were disappearing? The infrastructure supporting Roman high culture was eroding. Monumental architecture ceased. The engineering knowledge, organized labor, and resources required to build aqueducts, bridges, roads, and public buildings were disappearing. Eventually, even maintenance of existing structures became impossible. Roman roads developed potholes. Aqueducts broke and weren't repaired. Buildings collapsed. Phase 5, the final fragmentation, 476 to 600 C. The traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. But this was more symbol than substance. The Western Empire had effectively ceased to function decades earlier. What followed was the gradual emergence of a new world. Germanic kingdoms established themselves across former Roman territories: Visigoths in Spain, Franks in Gaul, Ostrogoths in Italy, Anglo-Saxons in Britain, Vandals in North Africa. These kingdoms maintained some Roman forms, using Latin for administration, preserving Roman law in modified form, claiming to rule on behalf of the Eastern Emperor. But the unity of the Mediterranean world under Roman rule had ended. Trade diminished to a fraction of its earlier volume. Cities continued shrinking. The money economy gave way largely to barter and payment in kind. Population declined significantly from Roman peaks. Cultural transformation continued. Latin evolved into the Romance languages as the educational system that had maintained classical Latin disappeared. Local vernaculars emerged. Roman literary culture was preserved primarily in monasteries, maintained by Christian monks who copied manuscripts. Yet this wasn't apocalypse. Daily life for many people probably didn't change dramatically in the immediate aftermath. Peasants still farmed, local communities continued, Christianity spread and flourished. What changed was the loss of the complex systems that had supported Roman high culture. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, survived and indeed thrived. Byzantine emperors would even temporarily reconquer parts of the West under Justinian in the 6th century. Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian faith continued in the East for another 1,000 years. Synthesis. Common patterns in civilizational collapse. We've now examined 8 major collapses, spanning more than 4,000 years of history and covering civilizations across the globe. From Mesopotamia to Rome, from the Maya jungles to the Mongol steppes, from the Indus Valley to medieval Baghdad. As we near the end of our journey tonight, let us pause to consider what patterns emerge from these varied examples. Are there common factors that appear across these diverse collapses? Can we identify recurring dynamics in how complex societies fail? The answer is yes, with careful qualification. Each collapse is unique, shaped by particular circumstances, cultures, and contingencies. Yet certain themes recur with remarkable frequency. Theme 1. Environmental stress. Environmental change appears as a factor in nearly every collapse we've examined. The Bronze Age collapse coincided with severe drought. The Akkadian Empire fell during a 300-year mega-drought. The Maya classic civilization collapsed amid recurring droughts. The Khmer hydraulic system failed partly due to increased climate variability. Even Rome experienced climate shifts during its decline. This doesn't mean that climate change deterministically causes collapse. Rather, environmental stress acts as a threat multiplier, making existing problems worse and reducing resilience. Drought doesn't directly destroy cities, but it reduces agricultural productivity, which reduces food supplies, which can trigger famine, social unrest, economic crisis, and political instability. Civilizations adapt to their environments. They develop agricultural systems suited to local conditions. They establish settlement patterns based on water availability. They build trade networks to exchange surpluses. When environmental conditions change, especially when they change relatively quickly, these adaptations may no longer work. Climate change is often relatively subtle. A 10 or 20% reduction in rainfall might seem manageable, But for civilizations operating near the limits of their environment's carrying capacity, that reduction can be catastrophic. The careful balance between population and resources breaks down. Interestingly, both too much and too little water can destabilize societies. Drought stressed the Maya, Akkadians, and others. But flooding damaged Khmer hydraulic infrastructure and may have contributed to problems in Rome and China. The key is that environmental systems that societies depend on become unreliable. Theme 2. Economic strain. Economic factors appear prominently in most collapses. Rome struggled with declining agricultural productivity, inflation, and the enormous costs of military and administration. The Maya faced resource depletion. The Abbasids experienced agricultural decline in Iraq. The Assyrians may have overextended economically through constant warfare. Complex civilizations require surplus resources. Not everyone can farm. Some people must serve as soldiers, administrators, priests, craftspeople, merchants, artists. The surplus agricultural production of farmers must support all these specialists. When that surplus shrinks, the whole structure becomes unstable. Economic strain can come from many sources. Agricultural productivity might decline due to environmental change, soil exhaustion, or disruption of irrigation systems. Trade networks might break down due to warfare or the collapse of trading partners. Tax revenue might decline as population decreases or regions break away. Inflation might erode the value of money. Particularly dangerous is when economic strain combines with increasing costs. Rome faced declining agricultural productivity while needing to support larger military and bureaucracy. This created a fiscal crisis that proved impossible to resolve. When expenses exceed revenue, states can respond by raising taxes, risking social unrest, debasing currency, causing inflation, or cutting services, reducing effectiveness, all problematic options. Theme 3. Political fragmentation. Political cohesion appears crucial for civilizational resilience. When central authority weakens and regions break away, the capacity to respond to crises diminishes. The Abbasid Caliphate fragmented politically even while Islamic civilization flourished culturally. The Mongol Empire divided among competing khanates. Rome's western and eastern halves diverged. Large empires face inherent governance challenges. Communication is slow. Local conditions vary. Regional elites have their own interests. Without strong central authority and effective administrative systems, empires tend toward fragmentation. Succession crises frequently trigger political problems. When rules for determining who rules aren't clear or accepted, competition for power can tear states apart. Rome's lack of clear succession rules contributed to the 3rd century crisis. Mongol traditions of dividing inheritance among sons led to competing khanates. Political legitimacy matters. When people believe rulers have right to govern through divine selection, hereditary claims, election, effectiveness, or other bases, political systems remain stable. When legitimacy erodes, perhaps because rulers can't fulfill expected roles like ensuring prosperity or defending territory, political instability follows. Theme 4. Military pressure. External military threats appear in most collapses, though their role varies. The Bronze Age collapse involved the mysterious Sea Peoples. Rome faced increasing pressure from Germanic and Persian enemies. The Assyrians were destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The Abbasid Caliphate ended with Mongol conquest. However, military conquest usually isn't the primary cause of collapse, but rather exploits weakness created by other factors. The Mongols destroyed Baghdad, but the Abbasid Caliphate had already fragmented politically and declined economically. Germanic peoples settled in Roman territories, but Rome was already weakened by economic crisis, political instability, and declining military capacity. Strong, unified states with healthy economies and social cohesion can usually defend themselves. When external enemies conquer, it's often because internal problems have already weakened the target. The military threat is the final blow, not the underlying cause. That said, constant warfare can itself weaken societies. Military campaigns are expensive. Standing armies consume enormous resources. The Assyrians may have over-militarized their economy. Roman military costs were crushing. Warfare can divert resources from productive activities, disrupt trade, and damage infrastructure. Theme 5. Social and cultural change. Less tangible, but still important, are social and cultural transformations that can affect civilizational resilience. Rome experienced gradual social and cultural changes over centuries. The decline of civic culture, the rise of Christianity, increasing social stratification, the barbarization of the army. These changes didn't directly cause collapse, but they transformed the nature of Roman society. The values, institutions, and social cohesion that had built the empire evolved into something different. Whether one views these changes positively or negatively, they meant that late Roman society was fundamentally different from the earlier republic or principate. Cultural confidence seems to matter. Civilizations at their peak often exhibit certainty about their superiority and their future. As problems accumulate, that confidence can erode. Pessimism becomes common. The sense that the present is worse than the past, that decline is inevitable, can itself be historically significant. Social cohesion or division affects how societies respond to crisis. When different groups within a society trust each other and see themselves as sharing common cause, coordinated response to problems is possible. When society divides along ethnic, religious, class, or regional lines, collective action becomes difficult. Theme 6. Complexity and fragility. Perhaps the most important insight from studying collapses is the relationship between complexity and fragility. Complex civilizations achieve remarkable things: monumental architecture, sophisticated arts, advanced technologies, elaborate trade networks. But complexity creates vulnerability. Complex systems have many interdependent parts. Trade networks connect distant regions. Agricultural systems rely on irrigation infrastructure. Urban populations depend on food from rural areas. Specialized craftspeople require markets and resources. When one part of the system fails, effects cascade through the whole structure. The Bronze Age Mediterranean world exemplifies this. The elaborate trade networks, specialized production, and interdependent palace economies achieved great sophistication. But when parts of the system failed, whether from drought, warfare, or other causes, the whole network unraveled. Without tin supplies, bronze production failed. Without bronze, weapons and tools couldn't be made. Without tools and weapons, agriculture and defense failed. This doesn't mean complexity inevitably leads to collapse, but it does mean that complex systems require maintenance, resources, and successful management. When those things fail, complexity becomes a liability rather than an asset. Resilience comes from redundancy, simplicity, and local self-sufficiency. A farming village that grows its own food, makes its own tools, and doesn't depend on distant trade is less sophisticated but more resilient than a specialized city dependent on complex supply chains. Collapse often involves simplification. Societies becoming less complex, more local, more self-sufficient. Theme 7. Cascading failures. Collapses rarely result from single causes. Instead, multiple problems compound and interact. Drought reduces agricultural productivity. Reduced productivity means less tax revenue. Less revenue means difficulty paying soldiers. Military weakness invites invasion. Invasion disrupts agriculture further. Economic problems cause social unrest. Political authority erodes. The legitimacy of rulers is questioned. Regional authorities break away. The cascade accelerates. This is why identifying the cause of a collapse is usually futile. Was it drought? Economic problems? Military pressure? Political instability? Usually, it's all of these, interacting in complex ways. Timing matters. The same drought that one civilization weathers successfully might destroy another civilization already weakened by other problems. Tipping points exist. Systems can absorb considerable stress while maintaining functionality. But beyond a certain point, relatively small additional stress can trigger rapid systemic failure. This makes collapse often appear sudden, even when underlying problems have accumulated gradually over decades or centuries. Theme 8. Collapse as transformation. Perhaps most important to understand, collapse doesn't mean extinction. In every case we've examined, people survived, cultures continued, communities adapted. What collapses is a particular form of social organization. The specific political structures, economic systems, urban settlements, and cultural institutions that characterize the complex civilization. What continues is human life, community, and often considerable cultural continuity. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed the palace economies and trade networks of the late Bronze Age. But people throughout the Mediterranean survived and eventually built new civilizations, including classical Greece and Rome. The Maya classic collapse ended the divine kingship system and urban centers, but Maya people and culture continued. Rome's fall transformed Europe, but didn't extinguish Roman influence or European civilization. From this perspective, collapse might even be viewed as adaptation. When complex systems become maladapted to changed conditions, environmental, economic, political, they simplify to forms that can be sustained. This simplification is traumatic for those experiencing it, often involving depopulation, impoverishment, and loss of knowledge. But it allows human communities to continue. The archaeological record often shows that after collapses, people return to simpler ways of life. Smaller settlements, local self-sufficiency, reduced trade, less social stratification. This represents adaptation to reduced resources and changed conditions. Over time, new complex societies may emerge, better adapted to current conditions. Reflections on decline. What do collapses teach us? As we approach the end of our long journey through fallen empires, it's worth considering what lessons we might draw. What do these stories of decline teach us about civilization, about human societies, about the patterns of history? First, civilizations are not immortal. Every civilization we've examined, no matter how powerful or sophisticated at its peak, eventually transformed or fell. This isn't a cause for pessimism, but rather for perspective. Civilizations are human creations, subject to the same cycle of birth, growth, maturity, decline, and death that characterizes all human endeavors. The question isn't whether civilizations will end, but how they will end and what will follow. Understanding collapse isn't about preventing all change, which is impossible, but about managing transitions, maintaining knowledge, and hopefully avoiding the most catastrophic outcomes. Second, success creates vulnerability. The very achievements that mark civilizational peaks can contain seeds of future problems. Large populations stress resources and environment. Elaborate trade networks create dependencies. Specialized production requires coordination. Complex bureaucracies consume resources. Military might invites challenges. This doesn't mean societies shouldn't pursue achievement or complexity. Rather, it means that success requires ongoing adaptation, maintenance, and sometimes restraint. The challenge is sustaining achievements without creating unsustainable demands on resources, environment, or social cohesion. Third, environmental foundations matter. Every civilization rests ultimately on its environmental base. The agricultural systems providing food, the water supplies supporting population, the climate enabling productivity. When those foundations shift, civilizations must adapt or face crisis. This has always been true, but it's particularly relevant today as human activity affects global climate and environment on unprecedented scales. The collapses we've examined often involved climate changes that were natural and regional. Modern civilization faces potentially much larger and more rapid environmental changes. Fourth, resilience requires flexibility. Societies that can adapt to changing conditions survive and thrive. Rigid systems that can't adjust break under stress. The question is how to build flexibility into complex systems while maintaining functionality. This involves several elements. Distributed rather than overly centralized decision-making, so that local conditions can be responded to locally. Diverse rather than monoculture approaches, so that failure of one strategy doesn't mean total failure. Moderate rather than maximum exploitation of resources, leaving buffers for crisis. Inclusive rather than exclusive social structures, so that broad segments of society are invested in success. Fifth, political legitimacy and social cohesion are crucial. When people believe in their society's institutions and see themselves as part of a shared community, collective action to address problems is possible. When legitimacy erodes and society fragments, effective response becomes difficult even when problems are clearly visible. This suggests that maintaining shared identity, ensuring perceived fairness in how resources and burdens are distributed, and building institutions that work for broad populations rather than narrow elites contributes to civilizational resilience. Sixth, knowledge preservation matters. One of the saddest aspects of collapse is loss of knowledge. When the Indus script disappeared, we lost whatever wisdom it encoded. When Alexandria's libraries burned, uncounted works vanished forever. When the Roman educational system fragmented, literacy declined and classical learning nearly vanished in the West. Societies should invest in preserving knowledge through multiple, redundant systems. Written records, oral traditions, practical training, distributed libraries and archives all contribute to ensuring that hard-won knowledge survives transitions and crises. Seventh, collapse isn't apocalypse. People survive. Communities continue. Knowledge often persists. New societies emerge from the ruins of old. The transformations are traumatic, sometimes involving significant population decline, impoverishment, and loss. But they aren't endings of human story in those regions. This suggests that even facing serious risks, there's reason for neither complacency nor despair. Problems should be taken seriously and addressed vigorously. But history shows human resilience and adaptability. Societies that fail in one form often succeed in new forms. Eighth, understanding requires patience and nuance. The temptation is to seek simple explanations. Rome fell because of lead poisoning, or the Maya collapsed because of drought. But reality is always more complex. Multiple factors interact. Timing matters. Contingency plays a role alongside structure. Human choices affect outcomes even within constraining circumstances. This means being suspicious of monocausal explanations and being willing to sit with complexity and ambiguity. It means recognizing that historical actors made decisions based on incomplete information, competing priorities, and constrained options, much like people today. Final thoughts. The arc of history. As we conclude this long, quiet journey through the ruins of empires, what larger patterns might we perceive? One perspective emphasizes the cyclical nature of civilizational rise and fall. Civilizations emerge, grow, reach peaks, decline, and transform. New civilizations arise from the fragments of old, often incorporating elements of what came before. The process repeats endlessly. From this view, decline and renewal are natural rhythms of history. Rome fell, but medieval European civilization emerged, carrying Roman influence. The Bronze Age collapsed, but new civilizations arose, including classical Greece. The cycles turn, and trying to prevent them is futile. Another perspective emphasizes progress and accumulation. Yes, individual civilizations fall, but knowledge and capabilities accumulate across cycles. Modern civilization knows far more than any ancient civilization. Technology has advanced immeasurably. Human capacity to shape our world has grown enormously. From this view, while individual civilizations may collapse, human civilization broadly advances. We build on what came before, learn from past failures, and hopefully improve. The arc bends toward greater knowledge, capability, and perhaps wisdom. A third perspective emphasizes fragility and risk. Modern civilization is more complex, more globally integrated, and more capable than any previous civilization. But this may make it more vulnerable, not less. The potential for cascading global failures is unprecedented. Environmental changes are happening faster than in most historical cases. The weapons we've created could cause damage beyond any previous war. From this view, we face risks qualitatively different from and potentially greater than those faced by any previous civilization. Our very success may have created dangers our predecessors never imagined. Which perspective is correct? Perhaps all contain elements of truth. History shows both cycles and progress, both resilience and fragility. The question is how we respond to this knowledge. One response is fatalism. Civilizations always fall, so there's no point trying to prevent decline. But this ignores that humans have agency. The decisions we make, the institutions we build, the priorities we set, all affect outcomes. Understanding history's patterns isn't about accepting inevitability, but about learning to make better choices. Another response is complacency. Previous civilizations fell because they lacked our knowledge and technology. We're different. We can manage any problem, but this ignores that every civilization thought itself exceptional. Roman intellectuals in the 2nd century CE couldn't imagine Rome falling, yet it did. Assuming we're immune to historical patterns is dangerous hubris. A better response might be informed vigilance. We can acknowledge both civilizational resilience and civilizational vulnerability. We can recognize patterns from history while noting differences in our situation. We can work to address problems, environmental stress, economic inequality, political polarization, military threats, while recognizing that perfect solutions may be impossible. The collapses we've examined weren't inevitable. Different choices, different luck, different circumstances might have produced different outcomes. The Maya might have managed water resources differently. Rome might have found ways to address its economic and political problems. The Akkadians couldn't control climate, but societies have survived droughts before. This means our future isn't predetermined. The challenges we face, climate change, environmental degradation, resource constraints, political polarization, economic inequality, technological risks, are serious. But they don't make collapse inevitable. How we respond matters. Perhaps the most important lesson is simply to pay attention. Collapses often surprise people living through them because warning signs are ignored, minimized, or rationalized away. Environmental degradation happens gradually. Economic problems build slowly. Political dysfunction becomes normalized. Then, suddenly, the accumulated problems cascade into crisis. Vigilance means monitoring the systems we depend on: environmental, economic, political, social, and responding to problems before they become catastrophic. It means building resilience into our systems. It means avoiding the complacency that assumes problems will solve themselves, or that our civilization is immune to historical patterns. But vigilance shouldn't become paralyzing anxiety. History also teaches that humans are remarkably adaptable. Communities survive and rebuild. Knowledge persists. New forms of organization emerge. Even the worst collapses haven't meant the end of human society in affected regions. The question isn't whether change will come, it will. The question is how we navigate that change. Can we manage transitions without the worst catastrophes? Can we preserve knowledge and values through transformations? Can we build institutions and communities resilient enough to adapt to changing conditions? These questions don't have simple answers, but asking them, taking them seriously, and working thoughtfully to address them is perhaps the best we can do. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it does rhyme. The patterns we've examined tonight, environmental stress, economic strain, political fragmentation, social division, complexity, creating vulnerability, remain relevant. Understanding these patterns doesn't give us perfect foresight, but it provides context, perspective, and perhaps some wisdom. The civilizations we've examined fell not because their people were foolish or their cultures weak, but because they faced challenges that overwhelmed their capacity to adapt. We face our own challenges. Whether we prove more successful depends partly on circumstances we can't control, but partly on choices we make. We've been together for a long time now, exploring the slow decline of empires, the gradual transformation of civilizations, the patient accumulation of factors that eventually cascade into change. If you're still awake, perhaps you're feeling the weight of all this history, the long, slow arc of time. That weight can be soothing. When we're caught in the urgencies of daily life, everything feels immediately important. But viewed against the sweep of millennia, our anxieties shrink to proper size. The empires we've discussed faced challenges that seemed overwhelming to those living through them. Yet here we are, thousands of years later, still pondering their stories. Our own moment's challenges are real, but not unprecedented in kind. Humans have faced environmental stress before. Economic crises have come and gone. Political turbulence has repeatedly shaken societies. Yet humanity persists, adapts, and continues. This historical perspective doesn't solve our problems, but it provides context that can ease anxiety. We're not the first to face uncertainty. We won't be the last. The human story continues through transformations that would seem catastrophic to those experiencing them, but that eventual descendants incorporate into their histories. There's something calming about contemplating deep time and slow change. The urgent loses some of its urgency. The permanent reveals its impermanence. We can hold our concerns more lightly while still taking them seriously. The civilizations we've examined tonight took centuries to rise and often decades to fall. Change usually happens slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly. We're always in the middle of ongoing processes, never at clear beginnings or endings. Life continues day to day, even as large patterns unfold. This means we can rest. Not rest from responsibility. We should still address problems, build better systems, and work for good outcomes. But rest from the anxiety that everything depends on this moment, that one misstep means catastrophe, that we alone must save or doom civilization. We're part of longer stories. We contribute what we can and pass the story on. That's all anyone has ever done. Through all the civilizations we've examined, the farmers and merchants, soldiers and scholars, artists and architects who built the cultures we've discussed tonight, they lived their lives, did their work, and passed on what they could. We can do the same. Wake each day, do what seems right and good, treat others with kindness, preserve and extend what knowledge we can, build and maintain the communities that give life meaning, create beauty where possible, and accept that outcomes ultimately aren't entirely in our control. This is the wisdom of ruins, the lesson of collapse, the teaching of history. Not pessimism, not optimism, but realism tempered with humility and hope. We're neither doomed nor saved, but alive in our moment with the opportunity to contribute to ongoing human story. Rest now. Let history's weight become a comfortable blanket. The story continues. But for now, you can simply rest within it. Tomorrow you'll wake to your own moment, your own challenges, your own opportunities. But for now, there's only the quiet contemplation of time's passage and the patient knowledge that the human story continues.